that I think is really, really essential to the civ-mil relationship as it is practiced day by day. And we miss sometimes as academics because we're thinking about big galactic decision points like the Cuban Missile Crisis, and normatively, what should everybody be doing? But as it is practiced and lived in the Pentagon, it's a totally different and much less distinct set of roles and interactions.
And tell us about your research now. What have you been working on recently?
So I think there are two big strands to my research. One has to do with military advice, and I've spent a lot of time thinking and writing about that in my last few jobs, working in the Pentagon for the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, working at the White House for Vice President Biden and Vice President Pence, thinking about the interaction that senior military leaders and civilian leaders have and how military leaders can provide advice in a way that is helpful, that is constructive, that's respectful, but that also is very candid and honest and sometimes brutally honest in ways that will help develop effective policy. So I've spent a lot of time both reflecting on my personal experiences as well as looking back at historical case studies to try to help the Army in particular, but the military in general, think about how to prepare its officers to give good advice. And then the second thing, probably my main focus right now, I'm working on a book project with Peter Fever at Duke University that explores the determinants of public confidence in the military. We've known for several decades now that the military is by far the most respected institution in America, but we don't really understand very well why. There are a lot of people who have different ideas or different theories, but nobody has really tested these in any sort of rigorous way. So we've worked to find a donor in the last few years, and we've collected our first wave of surveys. We're getting ready to do another one either later this summer or fall to try to look at that question of why is it that people respect the military so much more than other institutions, and what are the real implications of that for the policy process?
So within the civil-military relations academic world, there's a lot of debate and discussion over whether civil-military relations in America are in a very precarious place right now, like a crisis, or if the challenges that we see in civil-military relations today are just sort of part of the normal ebb and flow of American life. And I was wondering if you could talk about where you fall on that debate and how you assess the general state of American civil-military relations today in 2020.
I fall in the really concerned bucket. We can debate the semantics of whether crisis is quite the right word. I think a crisis implies that we're on the tipping point or the breaking point, or everything is about to completely disintegrate. I don't think we're there yet, but I think we are pursuing a few trends that could get us there. And the way these things work is it's not necessarily linear, right? The trend itself could become exponential and accelerate, and we'd find ourselves in a really bad place seemingly all of a sudden, even though nerds like us have been waving our hands over our heads for a while. One of the trends that I worry about the most is politicization of the military, which is a long, hard to pronounce word, but it just means, is the military being seen by everyday Americans and politicians as a partisan political constituency? Is there one party that feels like the military is their co-partisans and treats them as such? Is there another party that feels like they agree with that and that's therefore that sets up a, if not adversarial relationship between that party and the military, then not a trusting, collaborative one? That's a really bad place for us to get to. And more in recent years, we have seen politicians willing to talk to the military like they are a partisan constituency. We can look to this administration for really accelerating that trend, but many scholars have noticed for years that the practice of getting retired general and flag officers to endorse presidential candidates has only been getting worse and worse. It started in the very late 80s with the George H.W. Bush campaign and has just proceeded apace. But, that's one of the things that worries me the most, because if you have the perception that the military basically is just aligned with a party. Then you have the perception that the military has domestic political preferences and loyalties. And then you have a lot of trouble if the other party is in charge conducting foreign policy and believing military advice and believing that the military will follow orders. And that's a very bad place to be in, right? So that's the trend that I worry the most about.
So civil-military relations today are incredibly fascinating, I guess is the best way to start off. As I said, I started studying civil-military relations in the mid-'90s or so and have been following it pretty closely ever since. And I think it's hard to think of a time when civil-military relations has been sort of in the news and at the fingertips of the American people as much as it has been in the last 2 or 3 years. Obviously, that has a lot to do with the very unique and brash personality of President Trump, who has definitely interacted with the military in ways that we haven't seen before. But it also has to do with broader societal trends. And I think, in American politics today and in civil military relations in particular, I think political polarization is the thing that probably most defines the challenges we face. So when you have a military that is trying to interact with two parties that are so divergent and that are so opposed on every issue, you really have a military that's caught in the crossfire. And so I think when I think about civil military relations, the first thing I think about is how does political polarization shape interaction between the military and civilians, both at the highest levels and, in the general public.
My colleague Mara Carlin is currently thinking and writing about what she calls it a crisis of care. I think we have a huge legacy from the ongoing wars war in Afghanistan and operations in the Middle East. That is everything from the very ambiguous conclusion to Iraq and probably conclusion to Afghanistan, if it can even be called a conclusion. And the feeling like the country sent the military back to Afghanistan and Iraq over and over and over and over for no clear reason. And that also undermines trust between the military and its society and its civilian elites that are in charge of policy direction. And then there's also, I think, a lot about just, we might call it the invisible wounds of war, but the psychological effect on both the force but also on a society. If someone comes home with TBI, it's not just that soldier or Marine or sailor or airman who's suffering. It's the whole family and the whole community around them. And that's a whole country worth of people that are still absorbing all that. And I think that's something that we should think about more, talk about more, point a lot more to the proactive efforts to reintegrate veterans in society and veterans' proactive efforts themselves. That's another thing that I think about a lot.
So shifting gears a little bit,
yeah,
we're very excited that a team of people is willing to take over this podcast project.
We're excited too, Thomas.
And we wanted our listeners to hear from you why it's important to you to continue this podcast.
So Jim Golby, my co-host, and I were super fans of the Thank You for Your Service podcast. And I'm excited to take it on because I think there's so much more to do and there's so much more to talk about. You guys had some fantastic guests on. You tackled a lot of the really big issues. I think there's more to talk about, more to say. This is an ongoing, always important topic for folks who are practitioners and academics alike. But I'm also excited because your objective from the start was educational and to expand these conversations beyond just the nerdy few like me, but to really try and bridge the gap that we talk about a lot between civilians and the military. And I'm really, really excited, and I know Jim is also excited because we've talked about it, to continue that educational and exploratory mission that is behind the podcast.
And what kind of topics do you hope to cover? I know we talked today already about defining civilian control, about politicization, about the crisis of care. What can we expect moving forward?
We want to keep talking about who serves. We want to keep talking about, we have an idea for a whole segment that's on social issues that sort of gets at what the academics call the gap, the gap between civilians and the military and the gap literature. but what that means today. What is the gap? Is it geographic? Is it about, do all Americans have equal access to the right to try to be a member of the military? You know, how's it going with women in combat? How's it going with integrating women into greater roles in the military? We want to tackle the question about, should trans people be able to serve in the military? That's been a issue of controversy recently. All of those sort of who serves issues and social issues. We also want to keep looking at the legacy of the wars, and then also thinking about use of force decisions going forward. We also want to have a little bit of fun. We'd like to look at Civ Mil in pop culture. Jim has written this really great article about the civil-military relations of Star Wars, and you can expect more of that to come.
Great.
We talked to Alice a little bit about this, but I know you guys have worked on it more since then. What are some topics that you're hoping to cover on the podcast going forward?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think I'm most excited about is an idea for a new segment we have called War Storytellers. And I've done some great interviews with a lot of people. Phil Cly was fantastic when you brought him on the show. But one of the things that we want to do to build off the segments you did on the media and pop culture and to the interview you did with Phil is to try to have a broader view, not just at sort of broad general topics of civil military relations, but how veterans of the last 20 or 30 years, or even before that, interpret their experiences, how they interpret their time going back into the civilian world. And so I'm excited about that, bringing different people, veterans in particular, who have tried to tell the military story in pop culture, either through movies, their own writing, sometimes through music, and bringing them on the show. That'll be exciting. And then I think another thing that Alice and I have talked about doing is looking at different aspects of the civil military gaps. That's one of the phrases I've tried to coin, is that it's not just a single gap, it is multiple gaps. And there are all sorts of different dimensions that civilians in the military interact on, from the way the military interacts with society in terms of the sacrifices that the military is asked to make, in terms of the way they engage in the policy process, from the resources that DoD has compared to State Department or other agencies. And so I think we want to try to peel back some of those layers and look at some of the different aspects and how that impacts civil military relations.
And when do you think listeners can expect new episodes?
We are shooting for June. So there'll be a little hiatus while we get our act together, but then we'll start rolling them out in June. And our plan is to have a new episode for you guys every 2 weeks.
Sounds like there's a lot to look forward to for the future. Thank you for your service. Thanks, Alice, for your support and guidance over the past year and for your willingness to take this on and move it forward.
Kudos to you guys for making such a great podcast. It's going to be easy to just keep it going.
You guys have done a fantastic job. We really are going to be standing on your shoulders and trying to take the best of what you've done and hopefully make it better and keep it going for quite a long time.
We're really excited for where Alice and Jim are going to be taking Thank You for Your Service, and to listen to their new episodes soon. We hope you will keep listening as well.
One last thing before we go. Walking around in downtown Annapolis and meeting classmates here at UChicago, when people found out we were in the military, we were often told, "Thank you for your service." And we knew that phrase is always meant genuinely, out of a real appreciation and gratitude for service. But so often, the conversation just stops there, at "thank you for your service." We wanted those conversations to go further, to be more in-depth, to create a real dialogue between civilians and members of the military.
We also found, as Dr. Risa Brooks said in our last episode, that civil-military relations is a useful vehicle for talking and learning about so many important social, political, ethical, and philosophical issues. Our mission has been to have those discussions in a rigorous, accessible, and informative way. And we want to thank all of you, our listeners, for engaging in those conversations with us.
At the Naval Academy, we were often told that midshipmen and cadets are part of the best and brightest the nation has to offer, and that military service is something to be valued. But all service is valuable. And by sending us here to the University of Chicago, the Navy gave us the opportunity to meet and work with students who will also be serving our country and countries around the world in equally important ways. Classmates like Annalise, Josh, Alec, Nilanjana, Izzy, Daniela, Elaine, Ethan, Felipe, and so many others.
We have classmates who will